Utsa is very, we are very grateful that she accepted our invitation. Last 2 years, the Inter University Center for Alternative Economics and the Kerala Economic Association wished to bring both Professor Utsa and Prabhat here and to interact with most of our students largely, and of course the teaching fraternity in the state. So finally it is materialized on behalf of all of us and the Gulati Institute of Finance and Taxation too, because we are 3 institutions part of this larger venture, and on behalf of all of us, I would like to extend a warm welcome to Professor Utsa Patnaik. So as an introduction, what I would like to make is the 2 points. One is why the work of, of course the title is in Imperialism and all. Normally people think that Imperialism is very outdated and all, especially in the academic sense of economists, but it is not. And her work is, in fact, talks about a lot of things which is completely the so-called neoclassical or mainstream understanding of what is economic history, so especially the trade. For example, we know that Manmohan Singh has done a work saying that the trade between India and England is always beneficial, but her work is the opposite of it. And with empirics, this is quite importantly and acceptably disproved the very idea of mainstream understanding. Same the case with the Keynesian understanding of, in fact, Keynes, who, based on the Keynesian policy, the Bengal famine was what actually perpetrated by the Britain. That is the kind of argument she was actually making. It's very important, and it is completely a very new, fresh perspective when you look into the discourse of economics, and which is completely missing in the mainstream idea. So in that sense, you have always a critical perspective, both in theoretical sense as well as in empirical sense. That is what is a kind of rigor as well as insight Professor Patnaik is trying to give to all of us, and in that note, she is the best person to speak, especially to interact with the younger generation. And I would like to welcome the president of KEA, Dr. Professor Gain Harilal, who is actually going to moderate the session, so no need to speak much on that aspect, and so we'll take care, as well as the KEA General Secretary Santosh Varghese, as well as Godwin Treasurer is here, as representative of Gulati Institute. Dr. Nirmal is also there, and on behalf of all of us, I welcome all of these dignitaries and esteemed institution, and last but not the least, the audience, because at the end of the day, you are the beneficiary as well as you are the participant in that. So I welcome all of you to this particular function, and of course we can make the endeavor a success. Thank you so much. Over to you, Raman.
I'll take just 2 minutes. In fact, I joined Center for Urban Studies for my MPhil program after my MA here in Kariavattom during early 80s. But fortunately for me, I've heard Professor Prabhat Patnaik on several occasions before that, because Prabhat used to come to Thiruvananthapuram. On several occasions I had opportunity to listen to him. And later, maybe every year, 3-4 occasions, I used to listen to Professor Prabhat, and I also had opportunities to listen to Professor Utsa Patnaik talking on related themes. And it's my personal experience that every time I listen to them, I feel that I've learned something new. Some more fresh light, fresh insights I got from those lectures. So every time I prepare to go and listen to Utsa or Prabhat, I go with this great expectation that I'm going to get some more clarity on certain aspects of what we try to learn. And the last lecture, the lecture that we had yesterday also was a similar kind of experience. That's what most of the participants felt. And I got such references from many of my friends who tried to contact me after yesterday's lecture of Professor Prabha. Now, let me also say something about the value of their presence in this workshop. It's a great opportunity for all of us, for all the participants who are going to spend 3 days in this political economy workshop. I'll just give the experience of a scholar recently joined in King's College. Last week I got a message from her. She did internship in CDS with me, and she got admission in King's College, London. And she just sent me the reading list for a development economics course. And I was just going through the reading list. Several references to Professor Utsa Patnaik and Prof. In the King's College reading list. It's a development economics course. When I mentioned this to Utsa, she was telling that no, usually for colonialism, decolonialism kind of courses, no, our work is referred to. But that is not true. For mainstream courses also on development economics, world over, their work is being used by scholars, and they are participating in online classes, and they visit many of these universities. So probably they are the best in the business, the best in the academic world as far as these kind of issues are concerned. And mainstream is also very keen to listen to them, because now they give a very different view, which provide food for thought for the mainstream economists also, mainstream scholars also. So we should try and make maximum use of their time here, 3 days, and we don't want to make formalities affect the program. So try to make maximum use, ask questions, you can give your suggestions, and then outside the seminar room also, they will be available, and let us make this very active process of engagement, deliberations. And KE has this great idea that now this circle, this group of students and teachers and researchers who came here should form a kind of network, so that now we can continue to learn, continue to collectively re-discuss, and also your own work can be sort of publicized through this network. We will plan it out through the process of this workshop. With these few words, let me humbly invite again once more, thanking Professor Utsa and Prabha for accepting our invitation. I didn't mention about my experience of working with Professor Prabha Patnaik. No, that's not, in fact, it's very difficult to explain the experience. No? In fact, those 5 years used to be very different in the sense, no, I've had experience in various institutions, in working with various people, but no, this used to be very, very, very different. So I'm looking forward to this workshop, these 3 days. I'll be here for all the classes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harilal, for that introduction. Now, I have been given a brief to deliver 3 lectures starting today, over 3 days. And I think I sent some topics, but I've forgotten what exactly I sent. But anyway, my first lecture will basically be about the historical origins and impact of colonialism on India and on imperialism generally, insofar as India was inserted within a global economy dominated by the then capitalist leader, Britain. The second lecture I propose to deal mainly with the period of independence and the attempt to follow an autonomous development trajectory for 40 years after independence. And in the last lecture, partly also in the second lecture, I will then discuss the reversal of the policies followed for 40 years with the inception of neoliberal economic reforms. And in the last lecture, I would go into some detail about the impact of neoliberal economic reforms, particularly on the working masses and in relation to the question of poverty, about which much is being claimed by the government nowadays. But today my focus will generally be on the historical period of India's subjugation to Britain. Now, in my jointly authored books with Prabhat, A Theory of Imperialism, which was published in 2016, and in Capital and Imperialism, published in 2021, we have drawn attention as an important part of the explanation of why a handful of West European maritime countries embarked on violent external expansionism. As an explanation of this, we have drawn attention to the historically very poor resource base in Europe, particularly their extreme poverty in relation to the primary sector. Now, you might find this surprising because generally we tend to think of Western Europeans as being rich and our countries as being poor. Exactly the opposite is the case. The Western Europeans were extremely poorly endowed with resources. Particularly the primary sector is what we focus on, and the primary sector, of course, is crucial for providing populations anywhere in the world with food, with fuel, with raw materials for manufacture, and with energy for cultivation and for transport. We stressed a basic material reality that was true in the past and remains true to this day. The climatic constraints in the global north limited in the past and continues to limit today its agricultural output very severely to a very small range of crops producible only in one season of the year. That is in the northern hemisphere, the warm season extending from May to September, October. Whereas in our lands, and this is a reality which no economics textbook talks about, in the warm lands of the global south, we can produce a very large range of crops because we have at least 2 cropping seasons in the year, in a given year. And in more favored regions where water is available, the same plot of land can be cropped 3 times in the year, compared to only once in North America and in Western Europe. Now, these crops include not only the crops produced in the north that we can produce, but additionally, of course, a very large range of tropical crops that could never be produced at all in the global north. That is, the supply from domestic sources of these crops for the northern countries was in the past and remains today zero at any price. And no economics textbook will tell you this basic material reality. I will come a little later to Ricardo's theory of international trade, which again ignores this basic reality, in fact, assumes it away. Now, in short, what we argued is that unlike any other sector of production, the primary sector, for the primary sector, import dependence became mandatory for northern populations. which wished to escape the trap of low and monotonous consumption imposed by their own very limited domestic production capacity. Since import substitution for tropical goods was impossible, they initiated a frenetic competition amongst themselves for accessing these goods that they could never produce from better endowed societies in the global south. Fuel for plowing and transport was also provided mainly by agriculture in the form of feed grains of animals right up to the mid-19th century. Fossil fuels really did not become, started to be used in the 1830s and really did not become important until the 1850s. The fossil fuels themselves, considered as a primary resource, are available to northern countries within their own territorial limits. At present, only to the extent of 11% of total known global supplies. Now, 11% is very small, whereas the commercial use of energy by the industrial north amounts to 40% of global supplies, but their own endowment is hardly 11%. In recent years, we have seen both abortive external aggression for oil and a return to agriculture as a source of biofuels because the aggression has failed to ensure supplies to the global north. Not only were northern countries heavily dependent historically on imports of primary products, including food, and incidentally, not just raw materials, but foodstuffs formed the largest share of their imports, right up to long after the Industrial Revolution. So there's a wrong idea that it was mainly raw materials they needed from the global south. Not at all. Foodstuffs were proportionately higher than raw materials, and they continue to be very high today in physical terms, not in value terms necessarily, because they don't pay us enough for what we export. Today's advanced industrial countries continue to be, if anything, even more import dependent for primary product import and energy import on the global south than in the past. So this is not something, what we're talking about is not something which is over and done with. It is even more important for them today. For one thing, in the past, our economies were protected to a certain extent by the fact that it took at least 3 weeks, even after the opening of the Suez Canal, for goods to be transported, say, from India to Britain. Now, with the cheapening of air freight, in a matter of 15 to 16 hours, fresh produce can be lifted from Bangladesh, from Sri Lanka, from India to New York and Los Angeles, and of course, in an even shorter time to Britain and to Western Europe. And you think of the warm countries of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. They are vertically below, if you look at the map, Europe. So it's a matter of just 5 or 6 hours in which fresh produce can be transported. So that protection of long distance and times has gone. Now the global north demands not only the produce it demanded in the past, but additionally fresh produce. So at an analytical level, if you go to a supermarket in New York or in London or wherever, and you find there are fresh roses on sale in January or fresh vegetables in sale, then these, analytically speaking, are tropical goods because these cannot be produced in their own lands. They all have to be imported. So their dependence on the global south is even greater today for imports than it used to be in the past. Very important to remember when we come to my second and third lectures. Now, in today's lecture, I would like to focus on some aspects of the great contrast. I want to go right back to the period when India became colonized, became a colony of conquest. In Western literature, sometimes you do not find a distinction being made between colonies of settlement and colonies of conquest. But this is a very crucial distinction because, the Europeans initially became colonists, for example, in North America. But North America, a country of continental proportions, is something where they settled in large numbers after, of course, virtually exterminating the local populations and driving their remnants into reservations, they took over all the land resources. And by land resources, I mean not just the crop producing land, but everything the land has below the surface, the mineral resources, the timber resources, the water resources. They appropriated all that, and then they migrated from Western Europe and later on from Eastern Europe in very large numbers. So North America is a colony of settlement, and which soon acquired, as you know, independence at roughly the time of the French Revolution in the 1780s. And similarly, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, to some extent Argentina, became colonies of settlement. And these became independent. Some of them became part of the British Dominion, but they were independent in terms of their economics. Now, this is very different from the colonies of conquest, like India, Sri Lanka, what is today Pakistan, Bangladesh, then Malaya, and Britain's colonies of conquest in the Caribbean and in West Africa, Kenya, and today's Tanzania. So this distinction is very important because in the colonies of conquest, Britain retained full control over the capacity to tax the population, and it retained full control, it acquired and retained full control over these, the foreign trade of their colonies of conquest. So we are talking now about India, which became a colony of conquest, not from Plassey, not from 1757. Plassey was important, but it became a colony of conquest from 1765, because that is the year that Robert Clive acquired the Diwani of Bengal, that is the right of revenue collection of Bengal from a moribund Mughal empire. And the right of revenue collection is what marks sovereignty on the part of the colonizers and subjugation on the part of the colonized. That is the crucial thing, whether they have the right to tax you or not. So I would like to focus on the great contrast between the East India Company's rule in India up to the mid-19th century, namely up to the Great Rebellion of 1857 to 59, and the later period of direct rule by the British government after 1859 up to independence in 1947. During the first period, we find that company officials themselves were often extremely frank and open about the highly exploitative nature of the economic relations that England had with India. They termed as tribute what Indians were made to pay every year to England, and they criticized the tribute, and they actually made estimates of what they called the drain of wealth from India to England. So the terms tribute and drain of wealth were not invented by Dadabhai Naoroji or by Ramesh Chandra Dutt. They were terms which were first used and used repeatedly by the company officials themselves. So I'll come to in a moment why they were talking about the tribute and drain of wealth. Naoroji and Dutt simply used the company officials' terminology and their discussion. They took it over after due references to them. Now, all this frankness changed drastically with the direct rule by England after the Great Rebellion, and the earlier openness was replaced by active obfuscation by the government officials in Britain, and also by intellectuals like John Maynard Keynes, obfuscated the actual mechanism through which England continued to exploit India. Now, going back to the beginning, which is always a very good place to start, the East India Company's trade relations with India started from the year 1600. That is when it was formed, the company was formed, with a monopoly of trade with the East Indies. But as I mentioned, the sovereign right of revenue collection by the company dates from 1765. Now, this was the inception of India's status as a colony of conquest. The colonial financial system by the 20th century, the later period, had become quite complex and difficult to understand. without the insights provided by a study of the simpler system prevalent earlier. I will therefore start with an overview of the period from the inception of conquest to the end of the 19th century. Now, India occupied a unique position among the colonies of conquest of the European powers. Of all the European powers, if you take all their colonies of conquest, Java colonized by Netherlands, Laos, Vietnam, today's Laos, Vietnam, etc., colonized by France, and of course, France also had conquests in the Caribbean and in North Africa. Now, out of all the colonies of conquest, India occupied a unique position by virtue of the vast extent of its arable land, its large population and workforce, and its immense biodiversity. The workforce, of course, I refer not only to peasants, but artisans and laborers. So control over the taxation revenues generated by this workforce, combined with control over their earnings from external trade, gave an economic and financial advantage to Britain that no other European country could rival. They were equally aggressive, the other European countries, but they colonized smaller countries. They did not have access to the enormous resources that a vast country like India could provide to Britain. And it helped to propel that small country, that is Britain, to the position of the leader of the industrializing capitalist world by the middle of the 19th century. What was the population of Britain when in 1765? It was around 8 to 9 million, maximum. It is half the population of just the metropolis of Delhi today. It was nothing, actually. But yet it rose to the position of the world capitalist leader. So how did it do that? And moreover, it was the first to initiate the Industrial Revolution. Not any other country, not Spain, not Portugal, which had acquired its colonies much earlier, but it was Britain which pioneered the Industrial Revolution. Unfortunately, the magnitude and importance of colonized India's trade in world trade, the role it was made to play in underpinning the international gold standard, and how it allowed Britain to become the world's largest capital exporter, is hardly either understood or mentioned in the literature today. It is, of course, not mentioned at all in the northern literature coming from northern universities, which do not recognize colonial exploitation in economic terms at all. It is not even mentioned in the writings of our own economic historians, because most of our economic historians, and indeed I too, have been trained in our economics and in our history in northern universities. So we have read the textbooks that have been produced there, which really do not deal with the questions that I'm talking about today. Now, the focus as regards global trade is usually on the trade and investment relations between the metropolitan countries alone, neglecting the centrality of colonial trade in the pattern of metropolitan trade itself. You actually cannot understand north-north trade without understanding and integrating north-south trade historically into the north-north trade. Underlying this is a theoretical failure to recognize, as I've said, that metropolitan countries lack the ability to ever produce, owing to climatic reasons, a very large range of goods producible only in tropical lands, and therefore became increasingly dependent entirely on imports of large volumes of foodstuffs and raw materials for not only improving and diversifying the very poor initial consumption basket inherited from the medieval period, but also for undertaking industrial revolution. Now, we mentioned deliberately in our book Capital, A Theory of Imperialism, that in the late medieval period in Europe, production conditions sometimes became so bad because there was only a single crop of grain over the entire year, for which human and animal populations competed, because animals had to be fed grain as feedstuff through the long winter months. And when the harvest failed in successive years, you have records in the European chronicles of community cannibalism, okay, where people were reduced to such dire straits when there was no food, harvest failed year after year, that they were obliged actually to engage in cannibalism. They would go to church, they would pray for forgiveness, but then in order to stay alive, they would actually engage in this. I am saying community as opposed to some kind of pathological individual. You do have individuals who are pathologically mad who even in modern days do this. Now, this is something you find only in one history book, that is Slicker van Bart's Agrarian History of Western Europe from AD 1500 to 1850. So, I'll give you the reference later, the full reference, all right? And this is never taught to any English or North American students, never mentioned, ever. Again, let me make a short but necessary digression to modern trade theory, which is taught to students of economics, derived from David Ricardo's argument that there is necessarily mutual benefit to trading partners if they specialized in producing goods according to their comparative or relative cost of production and exchanged through trade according to their comparative advantage. Now, I pointed out in a paper I wrote a long time ago, which was published in 2006, it's titled Ricardo's Fallacy. There is a logical mistake in Ricardo's argument, because Ricardo assumes the very opposite of what I've been talking about. He assumes the opposite of the material reality that a large range of actually traded goods could never be produced in cold temperate lands, and hence their cost of production cannot even be defined. So if the output is zero there is no cost of production. If there is no absolute cost of production, there is no relative cost of production. What is the cost of production of sugarcane in Germany? What is the cost of production of coffee in the US? The United States consumes millions of gallons of coffee. It cannot produce coffee. What is the cost of production of raw cotton in Britain? Britain cannot produce raw cotton. So no cost of production is even definable. So Ricardo's assumption actually meant assuming away the actual basis of colonial exploitation. Why did the Europeans undertake a very long and hazardous sea journey and face the rigors of a climate they were not used to, face the rigors of being dead from cholera or other things that they did not have their own country? Obviously, because there was enormous economic gain for them, and the economic gain consisted in the past and continues in the present of their acquiring access to goods that they can never import substitute. All right. So Ricardo's famous example of Portugal and England is two country, two good model. Production of cotton cloth and wine in Britain and in Portugal. Now, there's a problem with the example itself, because Britain is too cold to produce grapes, particularly at the time Ricardo was writing, when there was no genetic modification of plants and the climate was even colder than it is now. So Britain could not produce grape wine. This is not true of the warmer valleys in France or even in Germany, but Britain could not produce commercially grape wine. So Ricardo's example had a problem. One of the goods could not be produced at all. So what cost of production? Does not exist. Even if you take, and the grapes are, a warm temperate crop. They can be grown in warm temperate climates. But think of the purely tropical crops which cannot be grown at all, except in the global south, right? So Ricardo's theory of what is not applicable is mutual benefit from trading, when one of the trading partners simply cannot grow a range of commodities for which the cost cannot be defined. In fact, the fallacy involved in Ricardo's theory is what logicians call the converse of the fallacy of accident. Now, the fallacy of accident is when you make a general assumption, an assumption which people think is generally true. For example, all persons can see their eyes. And then you apply it to a special case where the assumption is not satisfied. Saying that all persons can see, the poet Homer is a person, therefore Homer could see. Actually, the poet Homer was blind. So if you apply it to Homer, the theory, the inference is not true. The converse of this is when you make a special assumption, a restrictive assumption, and reach a certain inference that trade is beneficial in this case, and then you wrongly apply it to cases where the restrictive assumption is not satisfied. So here Ricardo is assuming that both countries can produce both goods. In fact, he assumed all countries can produce all goods implicitly, drew the inference that trade according to comparative advantage is necessarily beneficial for both countries. But then economists have applied this inference wrongly to cases where the assumption is not true. They have applied it to colonial trade as well. Okay? So this is a fallacy in Ricardo's theory. And by the way, it is not as though I'm the only person who has spotted the fallacy. Paul Samuelson spotted the fallacy, but what did he do? What he did was to quietly change Ricardo's example in his textbook. And he also has an article called Market Mechanisms and Maximization. You will find it in the collected works of Paul A. Samuelson. Market Mechanisms and Maximization, in which he applies linear programming analysis to Ricardo. He's specifically talking about Ricardo. And you can see why linear transformation is applicable, because in his theory there's a transformation, linear transformation frontier between cloth and wine. So in the example also, he says Ricardo's example, but he changes Ricardo's example. He puts cloth along one axis, and instead of wine, he puts food along the other axis. Quietly, he doesn't tell you that Ricardo had a different example. He doesn't tell you that he's changing the. And if an academic is presumptuous enough to change Ricardo's example, surely he should be honest enough to level with you, to level with the reader, to tell you why he's changing the example. But he does it quietly and clandestinely because he knows there's a problem. But changing the example does not make the theory right. You can always find a particular example which fits your theory. Okay? But that does not make the theory correct or get rid of the fallacy. All right? Because we can always find a particular example where Ricardo's assumption both countries produce both goods is true. But it still is a restrictive example which cannot be applied to global trade. So finding a particular example does not put it right. So, what I'm trying to say is that you have to have a very critical attitude to your textbooks. Unfortunately, since we in the global south tend to be generally intellectually servile, and I'm using very strong terms here, because I think we are intellectually servile. Look at the way we keep talking about world class, world class. Now, having a world class institution in India is okay. Maybe if you're talking about technology or science. But world class in the humanities is not okay. Because in the humanities, the literature is not world class. It is not first class. 80% of it is very inferior. It is intellectually dishonest. Okay? So we should stop talking about world class, building world class institutions, but say rather that we will be the institution which will be considered world class by other countries in the world. You have to change your entire mindset in this regard. All right, I think I've spent enough time on Ricardo, and the moment I start talking about Ricardo, people say, oh no, because I have a critique not only of Ricardo on trade, but also Ricardo on rent, which I don't want to go into here, because Ricardo also had an incorrect theory of rent, which I've talked about in my preface to volume 1. In the two-volume series, the two-volume book I published some time ago, Leftward Books, The Agrarian Question in Marx and His Successors. So the introduction to the first volume has my critique of Ricardo's theory of rent, which is completely different from Adam Smith's theory or Marx's theory of rent. And again, Marx's theory and Adam Smith's theory have been cut out of textbooks completely. And students are only taught Ricardo's theory of rent, which actually is not a theory of rent at all. It's a theory of surplus profit. Anyway, let me not get into that now. So getting back to colonized India, the terms tribute and drain from India to Britain were freely and interchangeably used by company officials themselves to describe the colony metropolis relationship. Who were these officials? One was John Shore, writing in the 1780s, very early on, who made a rough estimate of the gross domestic product of Bengal province. He placed it very close to the GDP of Britain at that time, in 1770. And he also criticized the tribute that the company extracted from Indians. He called it the tribute, that is the taxes that the company extracted. What exactly was the tribute? That the taxes that the company extracted, a large proportion of that was spent in England and was not spent within India. So that was a tribute that India was forced to pay. Then Robert Montgomery Martin wrote in the 1830s. Now, Robert Montgomery Martin was actually deputed by the company to summarize a very extensive study which had been earlier made, and he wrote voluminously and critically on the state of the company's Indian possessions, how the company was exploiting Indians, and he made an estimate of the drain of wealth. And he deplored the drain of wealth, again said we are extracting tribute, and this tribute which is spent in England is a drain of wealth. It reduces the income of Indians. The third person who wrote about the drain of wealth and the tribute was George Wingate. He was an army man, colonel, or was he major? Major George Wingate, who was entrusted with establishing the Rayatwari system in Bombay. He also wrote a book on this. Now, these high company officials were addressing their own peers, not Indians. For I think it would be fair to say that educated Indians at that time, the late 18th century, very early 19th century, were less concerned with economic matters than they were with countering the cultural challenges posed by the impact of Christianity with its theoretical, if not practical, message of egalitarianism upon their hierarchical, caste-based social system. And this impact was very strong in Bengal in particular, because that's where British rule started. It gave rise to the movement for reforming Hinduism, gave rise to the establishment of the Brahmo Samaj. So this was at a cultural level that people were reacting in India. After the Great Rebellion of 1857, the earlier frankness was replaced in the statements and writings of leading British economists and administrators, as I've said, by active obfuscation of the working of the financial mechanism of surplus extraction, which had become more complex after the Great Rebellion. Now, what exactly was the tribute? And why was direct conquest necessary, considered necessary? Why could they not continue to engage in normal trade? Why did they have to have first trade at gunpoint and then conquest, which they did not have vis-a-vis other countries? Now, the point is that East India Company, as well as the Dutch East India Company, incurred a constant outflow of silver to pay for its merchandise trade deficit with Asia, because they wanted goods from us. They wanted Asian goods they could not produce. But our populations, whether in India or China or other Asian populations, had no real demand for northern goods. We could produce everything that we wanted. So, for example, I give the quote from the Chinese emperor. It's a very nice thing that the Chinese emperor wrote to King George III in a letter when George III had actually sent an envoy to ask for trade concessions from the Chinese. But I don't think I can find it. There's always the problem that when you're looking for quotes, you can never find it when you want it. Anyway, if I find it later, I'll read it out to you. So these Western countries, all of them, France, Netherlands, Britain, etc., always had a trade deficit vis-a-vis Asia, as long as trade was normal trade, even though they tried their best to push down the prices at which they purchased from us. But the moment they conquered, the situation changed completely, because the sovereign right of tax collection meant now they could gather money from the local population by way of taxes and by way of operating monopolies, like in Britain operated the opium monopoly and the salt monopoly, which remained very important right into the 20th century. So then they could use the locally raised taxes to purchase the goods they wanted. And therefore, these goods became completely free from them. They created no external liability. Not only did the East India Company benefit because its own outlay in trade became zero, it did not have to advance a single penny to purchase the goods. So its profit rate rose to dizzying heights, but the British economy benefited because it no longer had a trade deficit vis-a-vis India, let us say. Therefore, it did not have to pay out any silver. Silver continued to flow into Bengal even after 1765, and that has been wrongly interpreted by some of our own economic historians, but it continued to flow into Bengal for other purposes, for financing special periods of military expansion into northern India, because they used Bengal as a base, and then they went on to conquer northern India, and later on, of course, the Bombay Deccan and Madras, and then finally, the last of all was Punjab in 1848. And Kerala, of course, was not fully conquered. It was only Malabar, which was, because Travancore, Cochin remained autonomous. So the silver inflow after 1765, even when it was there, was for different purposes, and also to meet the Britain's trade deficit vis-a-vis China, because it imported silk and porcelain and tea from China, but the Chinese wanted nothing from Britain. So it always had a trade deficit vis-a-vis China. Now, what it did in India, as you know, was to force Indians to grow opium, and then it used that opium and it purchased the opium out of the Indians' own tax payment. So what they paid the opium growers in India, they paid out of their own taxes. And then it forced the Chinese to import the opium. The Chinese had a legal ban on import of opium. It's a drug after all. They didn't want to turn their nation into a nation of drug addicts. So they used military force to open by force the ports of China in the 3 opium wars, so that they could dump their opium grown in India on China. This was the pattern of triangular trade which was established even before the British Crown took over India. So the enormous benefit to Britain of this of conquest lay in the use of taxation revenues. But of course, I can't leave the subject without a brief mention of the immediate aftermath. Between 1765 and 1770, the company officials in Bengal seem to have gone completely mad with avarice, because, you know, this was a new experience for them. They were a trading company. To have the right of collecting taxes from the population was something completely new. So they increased the threefold, by 300%, the revenues they collected in Bengal compared to what the Nawab had been collecting. So between 1765 and 1770, revenue collections were trebled. Now the Nawab was already, he was not somebody who did not collect enough revenue. He collected enough revenue to leave the peasants with enough to survive on and to continue production. Now imagine within 5 years, if the collection is trebled, it means that the seed corn was taken away, the consumption, rice consumption that the farmers had kept for themselves, that was taken away. So within 3 years, there was a massive famine in Bengal by 1769-70. This famine, again, discussion of it is completely suppressed in the literature. According to the company officials themselves, the board of directors of the company sent their officials on a tour of the Bengal districts, and they said that 1/3 of the population of Bengal had perished in the famine. And why did they not resist? Because it was so sudden. I mean, for decade after decade, the peasants had been producing. Yes, the Nawab took taxes for them, but in moderation, to a sensible extent, not so much that they starved. And suddenly you have the foreigners coming, using local mercenaries to raise the taxation to unheard of limits. And as a result, they starved to death. They were simply not prepared. to resist. There was resistance. Later on, there was the Sannyasi rebellion and other rebellions, but not from the peasantry, from groups who were on the fringes of the peasantry and who did undertake armed rebellion, which was crushed. Now, you will not find a single discussion. The Cambridge Economic History of India has more than 1,000 pages on the economic history of India. Not a single discussion of this massive famine. I mean, the population of Bengal at that date was 30 million, according to the East India Company estimates. 10 million people died. That is 1/3 of the population died in the famine. Not only is there no discussion by foreign authors, there is no discussion by Indian authors also. No proper discussion of the Bengal famine to this day, of this first famine. There were subsequent famines also, of course. But this very first famine, you find no proper discussion. Because as I've said, the sad thing is that we take our cues, as far as research is concerned, from which the foreigners write. We are completely subservient to this idea that whatever they write must be the Vedas and the Upanishads, you see. Whereas they have a very strong incentive to suppress what actually happened, and that is what they actually did. Now, from 1765 onwards, the company used more than half of the gross revenues to extend its rule, while at least a quarter of the gross revenues means gross, and if you deduct the cost of collection, then 1/3 of the net revenues, net of the cost of collection, was used to purchase export goods. So you had a completely costless inflow in Britain of an enormous range of food, that is rice, saltpeter, at that time manufactured goods, manufactured textiles, because Britain could not produce cotton textiles at that time in the up to the 1760s. And so on. So I have an estimate of the drain at that time, which closely follows Montgomery Martin's estimate, which, and I find in that, it is published in an article called The Free Lunch, and it's in a book edited by K.S. Jomo. I'll give you the references to those who are interested. I'll send a list of the references to you, and people can consult it. And if you can't get it in the library or online easily, then I can always send a soft copy for circulation to those of you who are interested. It is very important to know our own economic history, because the most ideological of disciplines are two. One is economics, the other is history, where you get falsification of facts. If you add the two together, what you get? You get economic history, right? So you have a double dose of falsification of facts as well as theory. So it is very important, to look at what actually happened. Okay, yeah. So the reason that Cornwallis was sent from Britain to, and he made the permanent settlement of Bengal in 1792. Cornwallis lost the battle in the War of Independence in North America, and he came straight from North America to India. He was deputed to look at what was happening in Bengal by the East India Company officials, and he made a permanent settlement of the revenue. There's a lot of discussion what kind of settlement there should be. Permanent settlement meant that a certain amount was imposed on the zamindars of Bengal as tax, but it was fixed in perpetuity. It would never be raised in future. All right. So the reason behind the permanent settlement was because of the depopulation that Bengal had undergone. Cornwallis wrote in a minute to the directors, Court of Directors of the East India Company, I quote, "I may safely assert that 1/3 of the company's territory in Hindustan is now a jungle inhabited only by wild beasts." There has been so much depopulation, whole villages were completely depopulated. There was 1/3 of the population was not there to cultivate at all. So to restore cultivation and therefore to restore revenue collection, he said it was necessary to assure the zamindars that you would have to pay a fixed amount which would never be raised in future. If you increase cultivation, you will get more money, but you can keep the extra money. You only have to pay this fixed amount to the company. That was the reason behind the permanent settlement. Do you have any discussion of that by Indian authors? No. Ranajit Guha wrote a book called A Rule of Property for Bengal, which was entirely on the permanent settlement of 1792. Not a word about the famine of 1769-70. It is entirely at the level of ideas. What was the ideas of Philip Francis? What were the ideas of Cornwallis? But the material basis for that, background to those ideas, why were they putting forward certain policies? And why were they debating? The fact that Bengal had a massive population deficit, that is not mentioned anywhere. You know, I'm sorry to be criticizing, explicitly our own academics, but that is what students read. That is the only literature they have. And they form an idea in their minds which is actually very far from the truth. Now, so let me very briefly mention, or maybe I shall go straight on to because I've taken already a lot of time. I only have about 20 minutes left, I think. Let me go straight on to the system that the British Crown established after the Great Rebellion, when it took over from the company, took over the rule of India from the company. Now, it was certainly not going to give up the very lucrative company procedure, which meant that, 1/3 of the net revenues which were being collected, and now it was not only Bengal, revenues were being collected from the United Provinces, later Uttar Pradesh. Revenues were being collected after 1818 from the Bombay Deccan. After the Rayatwari settlement, revenues were being collected from Madras Presidency, also from the second decade of the 19th century onwards. So the whole revenue collection had grown trebled compared to the initial, and up to 1/3 of the net collections was still being used for purchasing export goods. But what the Crown did from 1859 onwards, when it took over, was that it put in place an extremely clever system. Earlier, the company was taking goods directly to British ports. And then, of course, the value of the goods was so huge that Britain, with its small population, which was at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, it was only 15 million, again much less than the population of Delhi today, in 1815. Britain could not possibly absorb the enormous volumes of goods, foodstuffs, and raw materials that was pouring into the country, which was completely tax financed and therefore free. So what it did, it was kept a part of it, and the rest it re-exported to North America and to the Caribbean islands in order to get the goods from the Caribbean. For example, Indian cloth was re-exported to Caribbean islands to get coffee and cotton. It got the coffee and cotton free. Indian goods were re-exported to North America to get food grains. Indian goods were re-exported to the continental countries to get the food and other goods that Britain could not produce. And therefore, these goods from the continental countries and North America also became free for Britain through re-exports. Okay? It did not have to, it had trade deficit vis-a-vis France, vis-a-vis North America. Those trade deficits were reduced by the amount, by the value of re-exports that it made to these regions. So it was of immense value to Britain to continue this collection of land revenue and using the land revenue to get export goods out of India, therefore not pay the Indian producers actually, but to tax them out of their goods. However, the financial mechanism became more complex. What they introduced was something, when you understand it, it is quite simple. But you have to try and understand it because it was different from the earlier mechanism of the East India Company. Now an officer, now a minister of the British cabinet, who became the second most important minister after the foreign minister, second most important minister in Britain, was designated as the Secretary of State for India. There was no Secretary of State for North America, there was no Secretary of State for Canada, or no Secretary of State for Australia or South Africa. There was only one minister who was designated as the Secretary of State for India. So what did he do? By this time, by the late 1850s, Indian goods were going not only to Britain directly, they were going, as I've said, they started going directly to the continental countries, started going directly to North America, later on to Japan. They were already going directly to China. And why were continental European countries and North American countries interested in Indian goods? They were cold temperate countries. They could not produce tea and coffee. They could not produce sugar, cane sugar. They could not produce rice. They could not produce a whole range of commodities at all. So even when they did not have colonies, they had a demand for these goods. So they purchased these goods from those European countries which had tropical colonies, from Britain, from Netherlands, from France. So the re-export trade was very important for the West European countries. Now, the Secretary of State for India invited foreign importers of Indian goods to deposit their payment to Indian exporters with him. Now, the foreign importers owed money. Let us say an American importer imports $1,000 worth of Indian goods. Now, he wants to remit that $1,000 to the Indian exporter. The Secretary of State in London says, you give me your $1,000 and I will give you an international bill of exchange which can be cashed in rupees. You can send this bill of exchange either by telegraph or by post to India, to the exchange bank, to the Indian exporters. They will deposit the bill in the Indian bank and they will get the rupee equivalent of $1,000, which at that time, since the exchange rate between the dollar and the rupee was 3 rupees could purchase $1 at that time. So $1,000 that the American importer was paying would translate into 3,000 rupees that the Indian importer would get from the bank. But where did this 3,000 rupees come out of? The Secretary of State for India had a legal claim on a certain portion of the Indian taxation revenues, of the budget revenues. That portion was marked off and called expenditure in England. Expenditure in England is a misnomer. It was expenditure by England because it was not necessarily expenditure in England itself. It was expenditure all over the world in payment by England for what it owed to other countries. So let us call it expenditure by England. He had a claim on 1/3 roughly. It varied. It varied between 1/3 to 40% of the entire budget revenues in India was earmarked for use by the Secretary of State in London. So the payment to the American importer of Indian goods, to the French importer, to the German importer, Scandinavian importers, Japanese importers, was via this bill of exchange. And it all came out of Indian taxation revenues. So ultimately, the exporters were not the producers. The actual producers were the peasants and the artisans. The exporters sourced their goods, they bought their goods from the peasants and the artisans, and they paid the peasants and the artisans out of the money. Let us say the $1,000 would be 3,000 Indian rupees. They would keep anything, 10 to 15% for themselves as their commission or profit, and the rest they would give to the actual producers, the peasants and the artisans. Now this meant again that the British were getting their imports free. Because look at it from the peasant or artisan's point of view. Who were the contributors to the Indian budget of taxes? The overwhelming bulk of the contribution, at least 95%, came from taxation on the peasants by way of the land tax, where they did not pay land revenue directly, but paid they were tenants and they paid to the actual assessee. That assessee took rent from them and paid revenue to the state indirectly. So ultimately it was coming from the peasants, and it was coming from the working population who had a very heavy burden of indirect taxes to pay, of which the opium monopoly as well as the salt tax. The salt monopoly of the British Indian government meant that the price of salt was per unit was 7 to 8 times what it would have been if salt had been allowed to be manufactured freely. It was not for nothing that Gandhiji launched the salt satyagraha. It was a very heavy impost on the Indian population. Because no matter how poor you are, the poorest laborer who only eats, some chapatis in North India or whatever you eat in South India, some ragi balls in Karnataka, or a rice product in Kerala, the poorest laborer would need to consume salt. So salt is a basic necessity. So ultimately, the people who paid the taxes were the artisans and the peasants and the artisans and the laboring class generally, laborers. Only about 5% of the total tax revenues came from the well-to-do. And the Indian capitalist class, which had started growing at this time, as well as the British Indian chambers of commerce, they all opposed income tax on themselves. They said, no, we don't want income tax. The government can easily raise the revenue they want by increasing the salt tax. So you have a very clear class bias, which Sabyasachi Bhattacharya talks about in his book, Financial Foundations of the British Raj. He gives a quotation from the minutes of the chambers of commerce, both the British Indian chambers of commerce and the other chambers of commerce, and they all say no income tax. We oppose income tax on us, or income tax generally. You raise the salt tax and get your revenue. So the British did not also rule India on their own. A few thousand Englishmen did not rule on their own over millions of Indians. They integrated the propertied classes into their rule. They made sure that the propertied classes within India, not only the zamindars, but those who monopolized money capital, those who were, had something to invest, they were treated very differently by the colonizers from the way they treated the mass of the population. This is important to remember. What the Latin Americans call the Comprador class was very important. And the Bengal zamindars are a very clear example of such a Comprador class. Because of the permanent settlement of revenue, they became ardent supporters of the British Raj. There were individual exceptions, individual zamindars who joined the freedom struggle, who were very important figures in the anti-British colonial struggle. But by and large, the class itself became pro-British. And that is a legacy which continues in the educational system of Bengal, I would say, to this day. Because by and large, even the modern Bengal intellectuals tend to be, on the whole, pro-British, even unconsciously so, if unconsciously so. It is very different from the classes which joined the Great Rebellion in North India, because they were the talukdars. They were the zamindars and talukdars of northern India who led the revolt, in which the peasantry, of course, provided the cannon fodder. Why were the talukdars and zamindars, why did they behave so differently from the zamindars of Bengal? It is because, under the settlement, land settlements, there was no permanent settlement in northern India. Every 30 years, the revenue would be increased. And if the talukdar could not manage to pay the enhanced revenue, his talukdari, his zamindari would be put up for auction. And anybody who had money capital, like well-to-do traders, moneylenders, and so on, could buy that zamindari or talukdari. So the hereditary principle was completely ignored by the British in the system. And large numbers of zamindars and talukdars were dispossessed of their hereditary possessions, landed estates, owing to British rule. And that is the reason why they participated and gave the leadership to the Great Rebellion of the late 1850s, whereas the Bengal zamindars were pro-British in that period. So ultimately, the system that the British put in place, this Bill of Exchange, this International Bill of Exchange, proved to be not only so clever that even our most highly educated people who have written on the financial system of colonial India, or who have written on the banking system of colonial India, have never really understood it or highlighted the system. And yet it was a very simple system. It was an international bill of exchange. It was called the Council Bill. It was called a Council Bill because it was issued, the full title of the Secretary of State for India was Secretary of State for India in Council. He had a council of advisors, so that was the full title. That is why the bill he issued was called the Council Bill. The second thing I want you to remember is that there is no discussion in our literature of the importance of India's trade as a fraction of global trade. You have any number of studies of colonial trade, but they all focus on exports and what exports India did, the value of those exports and Indian imports. They do not even give you the trade balances, all right? But that you can easily work out. If they give you the exports and the imports, subtract one from the other, you can get the merchandise trade balance. But in no single reading that I have read, and I've read very extensively, is there any mention of, all that I'm saying, somebody could shrug off and say, as in fact David Harvey did in his rejoinder to us, he said, well, India was hardly very important in global trade. Without knowing anything about the subject, India was extremely important in terms of global trade, because at least from the 1880s right up to 1929, for a period of 50 years for which we have international trade data, India had the second largest merchandise export surplus in the world. The largest was the US, and India's was the second largest. India was a long way behind the US quantitatively. Now, these data we can get from a United Nations online material on international trade flows, which was put online with the date. Its date is 1962, okay, and it covers the period from 1900 to 1960. I have not seen a reference to this material anywhere in the literature of our economic historians. It's a very rich source because it gives you the country-wise data of exports and imports of every country in the world which had a statistical system between 1900 and 1960. So from this we can work out what India's merchandise trade surplus was, trade balance was rather, but it was always a trade surplus. Except for 2 or 3 years, India never had a trade deficit vis-a-vis the world. It was remarkable. And it was the second largest after the US trade surplus. It was ahead of Argentina. Argentina was just behind India, okay? So India's trade was not unimportant, but the way it has not been talked about, it has not been written about at all. The people, even if you say that Britain took India's export surplus earnings, people say, well, it couldn't have been very important. On the contrary, without appropriating India's earnings, and remember, India's earnings became this large because India was exporting not only to Britain but to the whole world. And the entire cold temperate world, which was developing and industrializing at that time, in North America, that is the US, Canada, Japan, as well as the dominions which were developing and industrializing, which were getting richer because they were not colonies of conquest. They all had a demand for tropical commodities. Okay? And India's was the largest, followed by countries like Malaya. Malaya had enormous rubber export surplus earnings, but for a much briefer period that India did, for something like 20 to 30 years in the 20th century. Similarly, you had export surge from Kenya or Tanzania, present-day Kenya or Tanzania, but for short periods of time. But in the case of India, this lasted for almost 200 years. So that is why it provided a solid base for the rise to imperial dominance of Britain, which became the world capitalist leader. Until the Great Depression struck from 1929, when of course India's export surplus earnings collapsed, along with the collapse of the earnings of other developing countries, other countries of the global south, which are now ex-colonial countries. And when India's export surplus earnings collapsed, the main prop of Britain's balance of payments, sound balance of payments situation, was removed, because India had been the main prop. Now, owing to the enormous amounts that it appropriated from India, and the only study that we get from a northern university, which is a very valuable study, is by S.B. Saul. It's called Studies in British Overseas Trade. It is the only study which looks at what kind of surpluses and deficits Britain had vis-a-vis other countries. And this found that, but however, Saul does not give you time series. Okay, now I have looked at the time series from the statistical abstracts of British India for the entire period for more than a century, from the 1830s right up to independence. So that is the basis for the figures that I have been writing, the time series that I have been giving in my various publications. And also some of it has been given in our joint books on imperialism. The more than 100 years of statistical data. Now, Saul gives you just a brief single year, as it were, snapshot pictures, 1880, 1910. If you take 1910, he points out that Britain had not only current account deficits vis-a-vis North America and continental Europe, it had balance of payment deficit because it was simultaneously exporting capital to develop North America and continental Europe. It was building factories, railways. Now, you know, capital export, for those of you who might be economics students, be careful. Merchandise export is a credit on a country's balance of payments. Capital exports are a debit item on the balance of payments, all right? Because capital exports is import of IOUs, so it figures on the negative side of the balance of payments. So usually a country can only export capital if it has a current account surplus, all right? If you want to have bilateral balance, India can only export capital to a country if it has a current account surplus vis-a-vis that country. But Britain was running for decades on end, not for just 1 or 2 years. It was running current account deficit vis-a-vis the US, vis-a-vis Canada, vis-a-vis Australia, and so on. But despite its current account deficit, it was also exporting capital. It was the world's largest capital exporter. It was exporting capital, and it exported to the largest extent to North America and continental Europe and the colonies of white settlement, like Australia, New Zealand, and so on, the dominions. So how did it manage to build up even larger balance of payments deficits than it had current account deficit? It could only manage to do so because it took the whole of Indian export surplus in earning, the whole of the gold and the foreign exchange that India earned from the rest of the world was not credited to India at all. It was preempted, it was taken at source through the Council Bill mechanism. It went straight into the account of the Secretary of State for India, straight into the British Treasury. Now, this is a mechanism of which you will not find any discussion, but this was the actual mechanism. If you look at the Cambridge Economic History of India, there is no mention of Council Bill at all in its more than 1,000 pages. There is one single small mention, casual mention of Council Draft by Anand Chandavarkar. He has written the chapter on finance, and he was at that time serving in the International Monetary Fund. So he's somebody who was very clued on as far as global finance is concerned. But as far as the historical operation of the mechanism of financial mechanism of exploitation of India is concerned, nothing. Not even our modern economic historians have anything to say about the Council Bills, and that is because Keynes had nothing to say about the Council Bills. I will wind up in 2 minutes. Keynes had a very long association with India. The first job he ever had was at the India office in London. The first book, and he was only about 23 when he joined the India office in London, which was the office run by the Secretary of State. Everything to do with India happened in the India office. And the first book Keynes ever wrote was Indian Currency and Finance, which was published in 1913. He used the experience he gained when he was working in the India office in London to write Indian Currency and Finance. Later on, he joined Cambridge University as a teacher, as a lecturer. And in Cambridge University, he gave lecture courses to students for many years before the First World War on Indian currency and finance. At least for 4 years, he gave 1 or 2 lecture courses every year on Indian currency and finance. Now, in the book Indian Currency and later on, because of he was considered to have become an expert on the Indian financial system in the colonial period, so he was put on every single commission that the government, British government, set up to look at Indian currency and finance, starting with the Babington-Smith Committee to the Hilton-Young Commission, then the Indian Fiscal Commission. He was either an advisor to or a member of the 4 or 5 commissions which were set up during and after 1913. All right? So he was a very important person in the formulation of Indian financial policy and monetary policy. Now, in Indian Currency and Finance, Keynes gives you the accounts of the Secretary of State for India, credit items and the debit items. On the credit side, the debit items are all the expenditures incurred by England out of Indian revenues. All right? Of course, he doesn't mention that they were incurred out of Indian revenues. On the credit side, he doesn't tell you the actual credit. What was the actual credit? The actual credit that the Secretary of State had was all the gold and foreign exchange that India earned from the world, which went straight into the Secretary of State's account. That was his credit. He gives you only the rupee equivalent, that is the claim that the Secretary of State had on the Indian budget on the credit side. Why did the Secretary of State have a claim on the Indian budget which is in rupees at all? Why did he need to have a claim? That is not mentioned anywhere in the book. Nor is the fact mentioned that it was Indian earnings of gold and foreign exchange against which you had that rupee claim. That the rupee equivalent is what was shown under in the Indian budget, in rupee terms, an expenditure in England. But I can find it out easily, because from the statistical abstracts for British India, which cover more than a century, the expenditure in England part is given both in rupees and in pounds sterling. All right? And the council bill values are given in pound sterling. So when I match the two, I find that the expenditure in England part of the Indian budget is exactly equal to the council bill's value, which is India's export surplus earnings. They're 2 different series, but they are equal over a run of years. They're not equal for 10 years or less, but if I take more than 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, remarkably equal. For example, from 1861 to the year 1900, India earned 530 million pounds as its global export surplus earnings. That is exactly the amount that was spent by Britain, as expenditure in England in sterling. Of course, it was not expenditure in England as by England. And that is the sum that I have compounded at a 5% rate of interest, which is a very modest rate of interest, because Montgomery Martin compounded at a 12% rate of interest. 50 years drain from India. That is from the time that Britain started taking the drain from India, 50 years after that, he added it up, the annual values, and he compounded it at a 12% rate of interest, because he said that this is the interest rate prevalent in the Indian market, and he arrived at a sum of 8 billion pounds that Britain had already extracted by the 1830s. Okay? So when I am compounding at a 5% rate of interest, it's a very low interest rate of interest compared to what the East India Company officials had done. And I arrive at a sum which is available in our jointly published books. You can look at it, which has caused a great deal of international interest. Up to 1947, the year of independence, if I look at the compounded sum that Britain drained from India. If I look at the compounded sum, that is 40 times Britain's 1947 GDP. Britain's 1947 GDP was 10 billion pounds. The compounded sum that it drained from India was 470 billion pounds. Okay, so the absolute amount is of course much less, because this is the compounded, the value is that I'm mentioning to you. And if I express it in dollar terms, it will become very huge, and it did become very huge. Why? Because the exchange rate of the Indian rupee against dollar at the time of independence was just 3.13 rupees for $1. What is it now? 83. So the rupee now has vis-a-vis the dollar less than 4% of the value it had then. But for 200 years, the exchange rate of the Indian rupee vis-a-vis the British pound was deliberately kept absolutely, sought to be kept absolutely stable by the British government. Why? Because it treated India's earnings, external earnings, as its own earnings. It took all of it. And it wanted stability of the exchange rate. So it kept the rupee sterling exchange rate as stable as possible, could not manage to keep it absolutely stable. There were international developments which meant that there was a depreciation of, but not much, around about 25 to 30%, 25% or so was the maximum depreciation. Then they pulled it back to a rate which was around 13 rupees to 1 pound sterling, whereas it had been 10 rupees to 1 pound sterling earlier. But in the 70 odd years after independence, the interest of the advanced capitalist countries is to depreciate our currency, because they want to get our goods as cheaply as possible. So you have seen a slide not only of the Indian rupee, but of all developing countries' currencies. An enormous slide, so it has only a very tiny proportion of the original value. Okay, let me stop there. I'm sorry to have taken a little more than 1 hour, but the matter to be covered was rather large and rather complex. So thank you for your attention.
You're telling that you're missing the letter from Chinese King Huilong to the George III.
Could you use the mic? I can't.
We're talking about an emperor, Chinese emperor. Right
Quotation you forgot.
King George III.
Yes, yes.
Available in Google.
Yes, yes, it's right here in front of me. But when you're talking, you don't notice.
Got anything to say on that?
Yeah, King George III of England had sent an envoy to negotiate trade concessions. So the Chinese emperor at that time was called Qianlong.
The name was given to our district, neighboring district. It's also Huilong.
Huilong. Ah, maybe Qianlong is from Huilong is from Qianlong. Yeah. Yeah. Of course, there was a very close relationship between Chinese trade and India, particularly Kerala. Yeah. So in 1791, the emperor wrote a letter to King George. It's a long letter. It says, quote, "Our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its own borders. But as the tea, silk, and porcelain which the celestial empire produces are absolute necessities to European nations and to yourselves, we have permitted as a signal mark of favor that foreign hongs should be established at Canton." So, he says that we don't need anything from you, but you need products from us. So as a great mark of favor, we're allowing you to set up trading posts in Canton. But of course, the thing is that they wanted the goods not through normal trade, they wanted them free, completely free. And therefore the Opium Wars. And they've got into a bad habit since they enjoyed so many centuries of getting free products from the global south, of thinking they have a divine right to get virtually free products from us. So therefore the whole of modern day neo-imperialism consists in trying to get our products on the best possible terms for themselves and the worst possible terms for us. So that will be the subject of my next lecture, when we go on to the period of independence, and what were the measures that were taken to try to de-link from the global trade system, the exploitative nature of the trade system that we inherited, and to what extent it succeeded or did not succeed.
Madam, I want to say, how could this imperialist,
Could you have a
how could this imperialist could not do anything on the Japan and China? Japan was never a colony for centuries, and I think China also was like that. What is the secret?
No, China was in some ways even worse off, because as Mao Zedong characterizes China, it was semi-feudal, semi-colonial. Now, semi-colonial meant it was not one imperialist country. It was practically all imperialist countries were located themselves in China. And through the unequal treaties, that is, in China, you had not just Britain, you had Belgium, you had France, you had the United States, you had Russia, you had Japan, which was an imperialist country in the in the 20th century. So China had to contend with its territories and its resources being demanded by every single imperialist power, every single one of them. It did not acquire formal political control, but it virtually acquired political control because the emperor, was powerless. The child emperor who inherited the throne from when the dowager empress passed away, it was a child emperor who ascended the throne of China, and the Chinese empire was virtually powerless against the demands of the Western powers. And they made China sign 99-year leases on its mineral resources on very favorable terms to themselves. So I would say that it's not correct to say that China, not at all. China did not escape. It had its own unique form of domination, subjugation. That is what gave rise to the resistance movement, both on the part of the Kuomintang and on the part of the Chinese Communist Party, which both fought the imperialists unitedly for a time, but then you had the Chinese Civil War because the Kuomintang had a different political vision for an independent China, and the Chinese Communist Party had a very different political vision for independent China. Now, as far as Japan is concerned, and I think Japanese invasion of China first, of Korea, they controlled Korea as a colony for a short period, but they very intensively exploited Korea. The Japanese invasion of China from 1937 meant the Chinese, for the Chinese, the war lasted not for 5 years, but for 7 years. And during that period, the Japanese killed 6 million Chinese. So the cost in human lives was enormous for the Chinese. It became an outright colony of Japan, very large parts of it, the parts that Japan directly politically controlled. And as you know, the child emperor, who was a young man by that time, was actually in 1931, he was physically kidnapped. And he was made to be the head of the puppet state that the Manchukuo, which they set up in northern China, which was the most mineral-rich part of China. Now, Manchukuo did not last very long, from 1931 to 1945. But the Chinese emperor, they made him the head of that in order to convince the Chinese population that the place is actually being run by a Chinese, not by the Japanese, though the Japanese controlled the entire area. Bertolucci made a very famous film on the kidnapping of the child emperor. He was not a child, he was a young man by the time, called The Last Emperor. The Last Emperor. So some of you may have seen that film. If you have not, you should see it. Very interesting. And after liberation and going forward of China under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, after the Chinese Revolution, in other words, this young man, Pu Yi, I don't know whether I'm pronouncing it correctly, Bu Yi, was brought back to China, and he was put on trial, and he confessed to having betrayed the Chinese people, and he asked for forgiveness. So he was forgiven. He said that I was very young at that time, I did not know what was happening, etc. He was forgiven. He was given a job as a gardener, and he spent the rest of his life as an ordinary Chinese citizen, engaged in gardening, which he seemed to enjoy.
No, no, let us get questions from students. We should give an opportunity.